Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Take Two. My guest today is Scott Mullin, who has had a fairly varied career in various places and worked in a lot of larger organizations, which brings him to have a particular affinity and interest in mentorship. Scott, let's talk about that. Where did you first get interested in mentoring?
Well, I think a lot of us who've been in senior positions, and certainly over my career, found ourselves in situations that I like to describe as something akin to, people asking me to be their mentor was sort of like asking me to be their Valentine. Notice I wore a red sweater today for the purpose of this discussion to drive home that point. And I think, you sort of say yes because you didn't want to say no. And then you'd go and have coffee and you'd have this kind of general nonsense discussion that didn't really go anywhere. And then you'd agree to get together, sort of a couple of weeks later. And then the next time would be a month later. And the next time would be 8 weeks later. And this was taking your time. And it wasn't an unpleasant experience, but it probably wasn't a very meaningful experience for either the mentor or the mentee. So I had a little bit of an epiphany experience when I was working at TD Bank around a particular individual who asked me to be his mentor. And he actually came into me with a PowerPoint presentation saying, I know you're really good at these things. I'm not very good at these things. Could you help me get better at these things? And it made me realize at that point, this is a joint venture. If you're going to be this serious, I need to be this serious. And how do we make that work? And so that's sort of where I began realizing that you can waste a lot of time not doing very much in relationships that are called mentorship. And you really need to get serious. And I think I have some thoughts as to how you can make that work.
So let's talk about that then. You've created kind of a template, you've created an approach to mentorship that you know works because you've used it. And as I understand it, you now post-retirement are wanting to introduce that to other organizations. So give me the best practices in how to be a good mentor.
Well, I think first of all, you have to set very clear expectations about what we're trying to accomplish here and to realize that this isn't going to become this isn't a friendship, but it's important that there is a relationship that goes on between the two people. And in that process, the mentee has to have a pretty good sense of what they really need to learn and what they're looking for from you. And you need to kind of look back and say, I think, I have the skills or I have the experience that you can benefit from. And then you need to set a plan. And the plan needs to be pretty specific about what it is you're going to accomplish together. I think, that's a very important part. I think a lot of mentoring to me, and people often talk about coaching, mentoring, there's all these words tossed around. I think coaching is more about specific skills. To me, mentoring tends to be the soft skills, which I think most of us know in whether it's the business world or just generally in organizations, soft skills are often key to getting successfully ahead in any organization. And they're often the hardest to sort of talk about with people about your soft skills. So there needs to be, I think mentoring is better focused on that kind of soft skill thing. I think in the process of setting a game plan and saying, what is it you want to learn? And do I think I can offer something in that space? Then it's also to have some feedback from others. So in my particular epiphany experience that I had in mentoring, I actually went to the individual's boss and said, in your assessment, is what he is describing as the things he needs to learn, what he needs to learn? He worked in a part of the organization where he was also had a sort of client relationship, a kind of support role. And so I said, I want to talk to in addition to I want to talk to your boss, I want to talk to your main client in the organization. And in fact, to give him his due, he had a pretty good sense that was shared by both his boss and his client of the areas he needed to develop to get ahead of the organization. So that process of getting that kind of feedback from both sort of boss and client in the organization, in many organizations, people do have clients, so I don't think this is an unusual one. That worked really well. And then in the process of working out a plan, I also incorporated in that saying I was going to go back every 2 months to those two people and say, what do you think? Something happening here. This is getting
Are we seeing any results so far?
Right. In addition, obviously, to his feedback from the experience. And I think, as I think that became then an agenda for us to kind of work towards about topics he wanted to get ahead on. And I think for a lot of people, mentoring is about things like presentation skills. It's about how do you develop and sustain and grow a network in the organization and outside the organization in many cases. And it's also a bit of that sort of, people often talk about executive presence.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have that kind of, do you have that profile? Do you have that presence? And so, that's difficult to coach to, but I think it is often, these are often the things that people are looking for and not sure how to develop. And what I found really interesting is that for the first time in my life during a mentoring experience, that, other than having coffee and drinking way too much coffee with people, I really realized I had to get really serious about how I was going to help him do this in this process. So, we had a very specific time frame. I think you need to work, you need to establish again the guidelines about how often are we going to meet. And what are we going to do when we meet? We're not meeting and having coffee. I don't need another double latte. Just that's not really what I'm looking for. And you probably don't either, being the mentee. So we worked through very specific things. Presentation skills was, and I know this world is better than I do probably. So he would sit down and do draft presentations with me.
Yep, great.
That he
Perfect.
Worked on. I would take him to events. I was in a job previously where I went to a lot of events. And part of that process was to say to him, at the end of the night, you have to come away with 5 business cards of people you don't know. And so how are you going to do that? So I guess the main takeaway is you need a plan. It needs to be specific. And I think the feedback loop, both when you start and as you're going, are critical to success.
So let's talk a little bit about now this work environment that we're all in. My guess would be, as I listen to you talk, that in a time of COVID, when people don't have the collegiality of being in the office to be able to build these kinds of relationships, and even going to an event and getting business cards, that
sounds almost scary to do that.
Is it the case that mentorship might actually help address some of that disconnection that people are, especially younger people on the career path, experiencing?
I think it's a really good question, Joanna, and because I think it's, I've often thought to myself, and as we've gone through the past year, that if I was still working at the bank and I retired after 20 odd years there, this would not be a difficult period for me because I have a network. I know lots of people. So having Zoom conversations with people you already know is a lot more meaningful than, hi, my name's Billy.
Yeah.
Those are really difficult conversations to have. And I'm not sure I've got all the answers as to how you would manage in this different environment. But I think things like networks and the support to help people develop networks for younger employees is even more important than it was before, because you are now trying to operate. I mean, I've talked to a couple of people who have just started in new jobs in the last year and haven't met face to face a single soul they're interacting with. That must not be very easy. And I think there's a real role for mentorship in helping people get through that and helping make some of those connections, introductions, and you should know, and let me do some handoffs for you to help make that easier.
Right. So is it your intention then, Scott, to maybe create some kind of a program that you would bring into organizations as a way of saying, here's how you do this, here's how you might set it up here? Is that sort of the what you're
So
thinking?
I certainly have, I've been asked a number of times. I actually did a presentation together actually with my mentee, who I'm referring to as this epiphany mentee I am. And we had a couple of hundred people turn up to it, because I think a lot of people struggle with mentorship. That sort of, people got told in performance reviews, well, maybe you need a mentor. And then they run around and sort of, go and, as I say, a bit like, will you be my Valentine?
Yeah,
Ask
have coffee. Go have coffee.
and don't really realize, and the other side doesn't realize as well, the sort of potential mentor are probably, most of them are not very good, and I certainly wasn't for a long time, at saying, this is a joint venture. We need to work. This is a job. This is not having coffee. So how do we do it? And if I can help other people through the experience I've had, I'm more than happy to do that.
What about the notion of giving advice? Is it a mentor's role to give advice, to say, hey, Joanna, I know what you should do?
Sure. I think, the other side of, absolutely. I think one of the things that also happens in mentoring relationships, or often happens, is people fail to appreciate on both sides that you need to know something about the person you're mentoring. There needs to be some connection. It doesn't have to be direct professional connection. The guy I worked with at TD was a finance guy, and I was a public affairs guy, and so he was a real banker. I was a public affairs person doing that kind of thing. But I had worked with him on a committee in the bank, and so I'd gotten to know a little bit about him and understood. So I had some connection. I don't think you can do these things as cold calls, and, have somebody come up to you and say, will you be my mentor? Like, I've never met you. I don't, I barely know how to say, much less spell your last name. And now you want me to be your mentor. I think there needs to be some personal connection.
Okay. Okay. Well, listen, this is really great to hear all these ideas. And I know I didn't put any kind of a handle back here on you, but people can find you on LinkedIn if they want to know more about mentorship. And I will look forward to talking to you about how that's going, that feedback loop, real soon.
All right.